Game 7 of the World Chess Championship match 2024 has just finished. And what an incredible, epic, brilliant fight. In my opinion, this is the most exciting game of the match so far between Ding Liren, the reigning world champion, and Gukesh D, challenger. Gukesh is playing with the white pieces and he opens the game here with a big surprise with the move Knight F3. This is not what he has played before in the match. So what has he prepared for this occasion? Let's have a look. D5. G3, it's a Reti system. G6, D4, Bishop G7, C4, C6. And now after Bishop G2, Knight F6, we are back in a symmetrical position, which can arise from the Slav opening, but also from the Grunfeld. It's a very topical line and it's one of the more reliable, solid systems for black. Both sides castle here. And now, a huge novelty at the highest level. The move played in the game is not the most popular move. In my database, it's number 15. It's not a bad move. There are so many possibilities here. Rook E1, but it's never been seen before at Grandmaster level. What is the idea? It's a sort of subtle waiting move to see what black is going to do. Well, black played the principled move, pawn takes C4, accepting the challenge here. But now white is able to launch his e-pawn. Therefore, the rook is well placed on e1. White is now occupying the center with both these pawns. And well, that is something very similar we have seen in earlier matches. Remember, Magnus Carlsen against Jan Nepomniachtchi, that epic game which Magnus won after almost 7-8 hours of play. Similar ideas can be seen in a lot of other openings. But it's a fresh position. And Ding, well, he was already half an hour down on the clock. And he has to find his own way in this complicated position. So I thought it was a very clever choice by Gukesh. Ding goes for the move Bishop G4, pinning the knight on F3. Knight BD2. This was still prepared by Gukesh. He's about to regain the pawn on C4. If you can recapture the pawn on C4, then white, well, materials even, but white is just dominating the center with that beautiful pawns. So the critical move here is to stick to the pawn with the move B5. It's a typical response in a lot of Slav openings, but well, you never know. There are always potential dangers on this diagonal. So it's understandable that Ding didn't really want to run into Gukesh's home preparation and played in a different way. He played the move C5, challenging the pawn on D4. White advances the pawn to D5, grabbing space in the center, and now the move E6. Well, it starts to look more like a real Grunfeld, and black is putting pressure against that pawn on D5. Well, there are quite a number of interesting options. You may even consider taking the pawn back immediately, but Gukesh went for H3, attacking the bishop. Bishop takes knight, bishop takes back, maintaining grip over the pawn on D5. Pawn takes back. And well, black could have taken the pawn here on D5, but wisely he decided not to do so. Because after knight takes c4, all of a sudden there is a lot of pressure here against that knight on d5. If the knight goes away, then the pawn on b7 proves to be very vulnerable. So instead of taking the pawn, knight bd7, it's a much better move. But now, after knight takes c4, I think we can call the opening quite a success for white. Why? He does have a passed pawn and quite an open position with the bishop pair, more space. So black is really looking for a way to try to equalize. And well, I think the move played by Ding is the right move. He tries to generate counterplay with the move b5, attacking the knight. And where should the knight go to? Well, important moment, there are a lot of squares available. If you go back to the center, then you're obstructing this bishop on c1. So therefore, instead, the knight went back to a3, attacking the pawn on b5. And now the queen comes out to b6, not only to defend the pawn, but finally black has succeeded in completing his development. Rooks are connected. That's good news for him. But the big question, which is going to play an important role in this middle game, whether this pawn on d5, it's a dangerous weapon, it's an asset for white, or it can easily be neutralized. Well, that's what we are going to find out very soon. Bishop f4, very natural move to support the march of the d pawn. The bishop is well placed there. Black plays rook fe8, contesting the rook on the open file. And now white moves the queen. So protecting the rook with the rook from a1. Rook 88, black also centralizes the pieces, and I mean, black is very solid. You cannot really say that black's position is bad. It's just that white has the bishop pair in an open position. Generally speaking, bishops are somewhat better than knights, especially these knights. I mean, the knights are protecting each other. They don't have really possibilities to move forward. But also the knight on a3 is sort of stranded at the edge of the board. So the knight comes back to c2. And where's this knight heading to? Well, also black decided here to move the knight away. Knight from d7 to f8. What's the reason of placing that knight there? Well, with the rook on d8, you're putting pressure against the pawn on d5. And very soon, black may consider the plan of putting the knight on e6, taking advantage of that pin on the d file, challenging the bishop on f4. So that's an interesting plan. But it's white's turn. And here Gukesh seizes the initiative by playing the move b4. Excellent decision, challenging the pawn on c5. And, well, of course, there are different ways to respond, but advancing the pawn to c4 to create a protected passed pawn is the principled way of playing. And is this passed pawn, is it a weapon for black or not? Well, the pawn can easily be neutralized with the move bishop e3, attacking the queen. And also the queen does have a lot of possibilities here. Should it go backwards somewhere to c7 or b8 to retain control over the d6 square? Well, Ding goes for the move queen a6, which also maintains control over the 6th rank. But after the move bishop d4, looks like this queen is somewhat stranded. It's not really nicely placed in the center, but everything is under control. Keep in mind that this bishop is now contesting its counterpart on the long diagonal, and there's no chance here to take on d5, because after the exchange of bishops on g7, the path for the queen is still open, and the pawn on d5 is well protected. So black comes up with a different plan. Ding is now playing actually very ambitiously as he takes the rook on e1. He's giving up the open file as white recaptures with his own rook and says, well, now the pawn on a2 is hanging. That's why he placed that queen at the side of the board. Black is up a pawn, but not for long. Rook a1, attacking the queen. If the queen goes away, it went to b3, well, then the pawn on a7 is hanging at some point. But wait a second. Also, this bishop on f3 is under an attack. So first, rook a3 was played, attacking the queen, indirectly defending the bishop. Queen to b1 check, king g2. And as I mentioned earlier, that pawn on d5 is well guarded. If you do take on d5, it's bishop takes bishop, and the knight will be hanging at the end of the line. So white is very nicely coordinated. This queen on b1 is almost trapped. I mean, if you go back with the rook at some point, well, the queen has to go back to b3. It's still possible, probably. And white also has ideas to take on a7 very, very soon. Therefore, rook d7 was played. Still, you may consider taking with either the bishop or the rook. But I think Gukesh is rightly playing more ambitiously. It's not about that pawn on a7. It's about mobilizing your passed pawn in the center. And with the move rook a5, he's attacking that pawn on b5. If that pawn is going to drop, then very soon, very likely at least, that pawn on c4 is going to fall as well. Queen b3 was played. And before capturing the pawn, first the moves were repeated. Rook a3, queen back to b1, rook a5, queen b3. And, well, Gukesh says, well, I don't want to draw. I want to keep playing. That is what he has been doing in a number of games already. There were possible repetitions also in other games in the match. But he doesn't care about the objective evaluation as we have seen in an earlier game. He just wants to keep playing. And, well, here it looks like he's just better. He has won his pawn back. Pawn on d5 is well protected. And here the move queen d3. Ding is trying to bail out to an inferior endgame, offering the exchange of queens. I mean, if you do take on d3, then that d pawn is quite annoying. There are tactical ideas here with that passed pawn, maybe with ideas to take on d5 and attack the bishop on d4. It looks like it's working out well for black. And therefore, Gukesh, not interested in swapping queens here, he played a very natural move, queen f4. However, this was a missed opportunity for him, as with the move bishop e3, it looks as if he's able to maintain more control over the position. If queens are coming off the board here, with a knight on c2, you do have fantastic control over the position. It's not winning yet, not obvious at least, but white's advantage is overwhelming. I do see weaknesses, especially the pawns on a7 and c4. The bishop can be activated. Looks very problematic for black. But queen f4 was played. And now there followed this move. Queen takes c2. Once again, it's the most natural move in the position. And Ding played it very fast. Bishop takes f6. That's the main point. You regain the piece as the queen is covering the f4 square. But now the queen goes back to f5. This is what Ding has been aiming for. He wants to exchange as many pieces as possible, as it will become easier for him to deal with that passed d pawn. Now again, I think Gukesh played such a logical move, but it's not approved by the machine. He decided here to exchange queens and ruin the structure. I mean, look at this isolated double pawns. It cannot get uglier than this. But what he should have done instead, according to the machine, is to play the move bishop g5. To be honest, I'm not sure a lot of people would have considered this move. But the main point is actually shown later. I mean, if queens are coming off the board, let's say you go c3, rook c5, you exchange queens, these bishops, they cannot really be challenged. And particularly that knight on f8, it's very passively placed, and white has possibilities here to try to extend his own advantage. Now let's compare with the game what happened. Queens are coming off the board. Queen takes f5, g takes f5, and even here, Gukesh could have kept more pieces on the board, but he goes for the move bishop takes g7. After king takes g7, he places the rook behind the passed pawn and he says, I'm gonna win a pawn. And that's of course a very important pawn in such an endgame. But the big difference here, if you compare with the aforementioned pawn structure with a pawn on g6, now that knight from f8 can be activated. And that's a very important resource for black. So the knight is rejoining play. Rook takes c4, knight e5, attacking the rook, attacking the bishop. And if the bishop is gone, well, then the pawn on d5 can be wrapped up after that. So where do you go? I mean, if you go rook c5, then another knight fork is there, attacking the pawn on b4, the rook on c5 is hanging. It's a very complicated position, but there are a lot of ideas. Even knight e1 with a knight fork winning the bishop on f3 is also a big problem. So after knight e5, rook d4 was played, but you're defending the pawn, but the rook is less active here. Look at this. That knight is jumping around. It goes to c6 this time. Taking advantage of the pin. You cannot take the knight as the rook will be hanging. And here with the knight on c6 you hit the rook on d4, but also the pawn on b4. Now you have to make a very important decision whether to stay on the 4th rank with your rook to keep that pawn on b4 supported, or you can move the rook backwards to stay on the d file and try to do as much as possible to support the march of the d pawn. It's not going to be easy, but it's an interesting try, rook d2. I mean, black can take the pawn on b4 and then you go d6. Maybe black has to move the rook at some point to stay on the dark square, bring the king over to the center. It's very complicated. Probably black is able to save it, but not really sure. Instead, Gukesh went for rook f4. And he is attacking the knight on c6, attacking the pawn on f5. And there's knight e7, of course, defending the pawn. b5 played. Now don't take that pawn on d5. There's rook takes f5 and white all of a sudden is a very healthy pawn up again. But instead, Ding played a calm move, king f6, very good move to support the pawn. And now knight takes d5 is a serious move to reckon with. Therefore the rook goes back to d4. Black played here the move h6. Calm waiting move to see what white is going to do, because white's pieces, they're sort of optimal. I mean, you may push the pawn to d6, but there's always knight c8, after which the pawn can no longer be defended by the bishop. So white here tried to move king f1. And here a very important moment, it's move 40. After this move, the players get the 30 minutes extra on the clock, and Ding, his last minute here before reaching the time control, his time was ticking away, and with 7 seconds on the clock, instead of playing a solid move like knight c8, maintaining control over the blockading square, probably black is very close in obtaining a draw here. But he decided to play all of a sudden very actively with king e5, attacking the rook. But now it's rook h4 and the h-pawn is gone. So I think that's a very important transformation of advantages. White is giving up his passed pawn So that after knight takes d5, that was the idea of Ding. He takes the pawn on h6. It's a very, very, very important transition here, because now white does actually have a passed pawn, a new one, on the h-file. It's not going to queen anytime soon. But since the d pawn is no longer there, white's pieces, the rook and the bishop, they're free to move and they're able to exert pressure on the several weaknesses in black's position. Now, that rook on h6 looks a bit offside, but can always come to h8 and get around to the queen side. Knight c3 played, attacking that pawn on b5. And I'm pretty sure this is what Ding had been calculating before he made his 40s move. But I'm thinking, and I'm not sure, that he overlooked this move, rook c6. Because white is indirectly defending the pawn here. If you take on b5, it's rook c5 with a double attack. And the knight is gone. You cannot block on d5 because the bishop is covering that square. So here the knight is not so greatly placed. The knight went back to e4, where it is stable. But what should we make of this endgame? Black is really, really suffering in the long run. I said already, this h-pawn is quite strong. But also, that king in the middle, it's on one hand very active, but because it has been cut off along the 6th rank, it's not so easy for the king to come back and take that responsibility of neutralizing the enemy's passed pawn. Well, difficult position. I'm thinking that something like h4 is actually quite a challenging move. For instance, Gukesh didn't play it, but if we go down the line, let's say black is going to swap the knight for the bishop, I think such an endgame is very, very dangerous, because, I mean, if the king is on g7, it's more safe. The h-pawn is not going to queen, but here the king is staying close to the pawn weaknesses. But how are you going to cope with that h-pawn? And also, there's a pawn weakness on a7. I think it's potentially a very risky endgame for black. But instead of h4, king e1 was played. Gukesh wanted to keep the bishop on the board, not allow knight e2 with tempo. Ding spent here a lot of time and almost wasted all his extra time after move 40. After the move f6, I think he was down to 4 or 5 minutes at this point. And the position is incredibly difficult. I mean, after f6, the king cannot come back to stop the h-pawn at some point. And I think here Gukesh missed a very important chance, as he started now to push h4. Very logical move. But you may start here with something like rook c8 to guard the back rank. And I think the rook is fantastically placed here, as it does prevent black from activating the rook with something like rook d3. There's rook e8 check. And if the king goes to the d file, you can exchange rooks. You can give up the bishop for the knight. And the pawn endgame with an extra pawn for white should be winning, obviously. So rook c8 is a very nice move. And I don't see a constructive plan here for black to stay in the game. I think dealing with that h-pawn is very, very difficult. Anyway, Gukesh launched the h-pawn immediately. Rook d3, great defense, attacking that bishop on e4, on f3. And well, if you do take on e4, then black gets a chance to improve the pawn structure again. And that offers great drawing chances. So here, again, it's still super complicated. Gukesh went here for bishop to d1. And I think he wants to stay close to the king to cover a lot of squares to avoid any potential threats of rook and knight against that king. But it does allow here black to play the move f4. And that's a very important resource, because when you're on the defensive side, you want to exchange as many pawns as possible to get closer to a draw. And it might be that Gukesh were counting on this idea with bishop c2 to attack the rook and knight. And he realized that this is not going to help. He didn't play bishop c2 because of pawn takes g3. And the rook cannot be taken here, because then the g-pawn is going to queen. And that means that after pawn takes g3, you have to take back. But then black is absolutely fine again. Material will be even. So instead, after f4, he decided to take on f4. But there's king takes f4. But here you can see that it's a big success, having undoubled your f-pawns and exchange one pair of pawns now. Bishop c2, putting pressure here. Rook goes back to d5 to stop the h-pawn. Rook to c4 to pin that knight on e4. Black can defend it here with f5. Rook b4, defending the pawn. Black was also intending to take that pawn, of course. And now king f3 super active play. And now you can see that Black's king is incredibly active. The pawn on f2 it's threatened to be taken. Bishop d1 check. Very important that you don't go back to f4. It runs into f3 with an attack on the pinned knight. So therefore the king goes forward, king g2. And that's a beautiful solution as you maintain pressure against that pawn on f2. Rook to b3. It's a nice resource. Don't take on f2. It does run into bishop f3 and the rook will be lost. But of course, black just moves the rook away. Rook to e5, setting up discovered attacks by moving the knight away. And, well, even a move like bishop f3 is not a problem any longer. You can go king h3. And even if you take on e4 with check, discover, check, capturing a piece. But there's king takes h4 and the bishop is going to be lost very, very soon. So black is doing absolutely fine in this endgame now. White tried here to move f4, attacking the rook on e5. Rook back to e7. Dealing with the pawn on a7. Pawn is well protected, covering the h7 square. Still, there are ideas like knight c5 with discover check. So white moves the rook to e3, rook h7, attacking the pawn, h5. Pawn is defended now by the bishop, but the knight goes back to f6 with the aim of wrapping up that pawn. Rook e5, knight takes h5, rook takes f5. White is still a pawn up, but more and more pawns are coming off the board. Knight g3, attacking the rook, rook f8, and now rook b7. Again, black is aiming for more pawn exchanges. Bishop to a4, defending the pawn. It's a sad move. The bishop is not doing well there. King comes back to f3 to go after the pawn on f4. But white's going to push the pawn. King f4. Black is running with the pawn together. f6. And now knight e4. The knight is back in time as the rook is excellently placed on the 7th rank. If you do push the pawn to f7, there's knight d6. And black is in control, ready to eliminate that remaining pawn. Bishop c2 was played, attacking the knight. But the knight goes anyway. It goes back to d6, maintaining control over that weak square. Rook d8, attacking the knight. And well, here king e5 was played. I mean, you could have considered maybe taking a pawn, but why to complicate matters? Just try to eliminate the most dangerous pawn first. That's a typical rule in endgames. Bishop b3. You cannot take here on f6. There's rook takes d6. So knight f7. Blocking the pawn, attacking the rook. Rook d5 check. King takes f6. And the danger is gone. Materials even. Few moves were played. King d2, rook b6. Bishop c4. Rook d6. Offering the exchange of rooks. White cannot avoid that. King c3. Rook takes rook. Bishop recaptures knight d6. And the only thing black still has to do is eliminate that pawn on b5. Because with a bishop alone, you cannot win the game. So the game ended in a draw. 3.5, 3.5. We are halfway the match. And in my opinion, what an incredible game this has been. I hope you really enjoyed these analyses. And I think Ding really should feel relieved having survived this very dangerous opening. I mean, he was lost in the middle game, in this end game also probably. So yeah, big survival for him. And that means that he still has an extra wide game to go. In the game tomorrow, in game 8, we will see how the game will develop. What's going to happen in this match. And definitely the last word hasn't been said yet. So many fascinating things are going on in this match, and I hope you do enjoy. And if you do like my videos, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button and watch the final part, the second part of this World Chess Championship match 2024. See you tomorrow.